don't worry.
I think that's all right. Yeah. Can
It's quite
everybody hear
robust.
okay? Everybody hear okay? Fantastic.
Uh-huh.
Sure.
What's the title of this talk again? Bright Young Things of the Jazz Age?
Thank you.
Right. The Bright Young Things of the Jazz Age. This is going to be a discussion with Sarah Churchwell, who comes from Chicago, and she's a professor of American literature at the University of East Anglia in England. And her book, Careless People, deals with the jazz age and the myth, the invention of the Great Gatsby. Lara Feigel's latest book, The Love Charm of Bombs, is actually about the 1930s, but as a teacher of modern English literature at King's College London, she obviously knows a great deal about the 1920s as well. And in 1988, the novelist and biographer Nicholas Shakespeare made a 3-part documentary on Evelyn Waugh and interviewed many of the bright young things, then of course well into old age, but with their memories still pretty bright. And since this story really begins in America, I'll ask Sarah to kick off with the jazz age.
Well, yes, the jazz age is actually a phrase that is invented by the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald in the early 1920s. He starts to use it. Nobody's been able to pin down exactly the first time that he used it, but he always claimed credit for it. And certainly by 1922, he'd published a book called Tales of the Jazz Age. And by that point, it really gets kind of set in America's mind that they have entered this new era and it's associated with jazz. Some years later, Fitzgerald wrote an essay called Echoes of the Jazz Age, where he explained actually where the idea came from. And he says the word jazz in its progress toward respectability meant first sex, then dancing, and then music. And he actually is sort of using that as a metaphor. He says that it's associated with the energy of the early 1920s, the vigor and the vibrancy and the rawness of it. In fact, when he says that it first meant sex, he's actually being a little bit euphemistic and polite, because what it looks like the word jazz comes from is an American slang word, which is the word jism. And jism is actually a slang word for sperm. So it did literally mean sex, and it was a rude word to talk about the energy of sex and the vitality of the ways that America, as also was happening in Britain, was reinventing itself after the First World War.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that energy is something that is so associated with the beginnings of the 20th century, isn't it? I mean, the whole of the 19th century seems to have been about buttoning that stuff up, not letting it out. And then suddenly, wham, it all sort of starts to explode.
Yeah.
Lara, the bright young people.
The bright young people. So the
energy.
title of this talk is The Bright Young Things, but actually the bright young people were a kind of more specific group who knew each other in England, and this is sort of the English context as opposed to the American, as the bright young people, and were very much a very young. Lots of them were sort of 19 or 20 at the beginning of the 1920s. They sort of self-styled as young, partly in reaction to their fathers, many of whom had sent the sort of their generation and the slightly older generation into the First World War, and they really began to be a group through a series of parties, much as in America, through a series of increasingly silly parties. So there was a swimming pool party in the early 1920s in which the invitation instructed everyone, and these were all, the sons of sort of lords and ladies. They were instructed to come with a bathrobe and a swimming costume, and they'd sort of drink cocktails as they lounged around the pool, which was wonderfully shocking at the time. Their parents had the courting had been done with chaperones present, and suddenly here are all these young people of opposite sexes sort of mixing in the swimming pool. They had one baby party in which everyone had to dress as a baby, bring a bottle, and the cocktails were served on play mats. And I mean, we'll talk later about the kind of different aspects of it, but I think just one thing to say is quite how young this world is, and the kind of the group included lots of people we haven't heard of now, but also some sort of well-known writers like Anthony Powell, Evelyn Waugh, who Nicholas Shakespeare will talk about, Henry Greene. And they all published their first books. Henry Greene published his first book almost while still an undergraduate. They were publishing at sort of 21, 22, in a way that just doesn't happen. I mean, I've been sort of thinking about them, I've been thinking about Literary London now, and thinking I'm often the youngest person at parties, which sort of they would have found ridiculous. I'm 34, and this is what Auden, who wasn't quite a bright young thing, but was part of that generation who privileged the youth. He said in his poem, The Orators, he said, "Those over 30, ugly and dirty, what are they doing except just stewing?"
Can I just add to that, because what you find in America is something very, very similar, which is Scott Fitzgerald in particular is extremely young when he's first publishing these books. He actually wrote The Great Gatsby, his great masterpiece, when he was 28, but his first novel comes out when he's 24, which is This Side of Paradise in 1920, which kind of kicks off the literary jazz age. And he famously said, as he became a celebrity, he famously said in interviews that he wanted to die at 30. He was going to kill himself if he lived to 30 because everything was just over after 30. So you have very, very similar sensibilities happening, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, cocktail parties are an important part of this in America. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but one of the main things that separates the American jazz age from the British jazz age is, of course, the prohibition in America. The relationship to alcohol is very different there, but we're probably not there yet, but it's worth thinking about.
And I think another thing that's worth thinking about is the way all this is amplified, the parties, the people, by the press. We've got a popular press which is always, I mean, is still today fascinated by youth and parties. But these people were giving parties like nobody had ever given a party. Swimming pool parties, green parties, you know, the baby party, the white party. And then there were also these treasure hunts where they'd all, you know, fueled with alcohol. They'd dash off across London doing a treasure hunt at about midnight. And nobody had done this sort of stuff before. It was, it really was.
It was calculated as well, though. I mean, they were doing it in order to call attention to themselves, again, on both sides of the Atlantic.
I think that,
the mass media is starting, I mean, mass media is a phrase that's coined in 1923. So this idea of media itself, certainly in America, is also exploding at exactly the same moment. And they're self-consciously putting themselves in the public eye and creating a celebrity context. Both groups are.
I think that's probably more true of the Americans, at least at the beginning. I think for the British, the group who were sort of first holding swimming pool parties were seeing it as more of a lark and something that was quite insular and didn't really want necessarily their parents to know what they were doing. And then suddenly the press attention came and it was hard to resist, and then they started sort of self-styling for the press, and the group began, and people across London started emulating them, trying to be a bright young person.
I want to bring the sort of wars in at this stage.
The war was...
That's Evelyn and Alec, by the way, rather than fighting.
Evelyn Waugh is the youngest of two sons of Arthur War, a publisher, and it's odd that Evelyn becomes identified with perhaps characterizing the jazz age in England as the bright young things, and he does so in his guise as a newspaper. He's a gossip columnist for 2 months in April, May 1927 for the Daily Express, and he comments on
Mr. Chatterbox,
Mr. Chatterbox,
I believe his...
and he goes to these parties, which was a slight kind of tension. I think he wants very much to be part of the guest list, but he himself comes from Golders Green to such an extent that when he posts letters to friends, he walks down the road so that the letters will get the postmark from Hampstead, which he sees as rather grander. And he's part of this. Many of the people he was at Oxford with, as you've said, like Harold Acton, Brian Howard, Anthony Powell, not Graham Greene, but become part of this kind of party-going set, which he, in Vile Bodies in 1930, when it comes out, he has this very famous paragraph about the types of parties which he had been commenting on in Mr. Chatterbox. Masked parties, savage parties, Victorian parties, Greek parties, Wild West parties, Russian parties, circus parties, parties where one had to dress as someone else, almost naked parties at St. John's Wood, all that succession and repetition of massed humanity, those vile bodies, which suggests that he was recoiling at the same time as he was attracted. And what's odd when you consider his brother Alec War, who was a very much more famous writer initially, Alec War had invented in England the cocktail party when he'd invited people to tea and then served them rum swizzle. And then suddenly this becomes the cocktail party. I'm sure he's picking up on what's happening in New York. And Alec War, who Evelyn Waugh's entire kind of the jazz age, the rebelliousness, the sex, he's trying to out-jazz his brother, who in 1917 was at Sherborne School when he publishes a novel called The Loom of Youth, which is fantastically famous at that moment because it addresses the subject of homosexuality in public schools. It's an overnight success in a kind of jazz age way. This boy is 17, 18, and it becomes the most famous novel about school days since Tom Brown's School Days. And he's a very good-looking captain of cricket, and he's expelled from Sherborne, as a result of which Evelyn has to go to Lancing, which he regards as an inferior school. And so he's got an elder brother who is adored by his father, who is a publisher, who is good-looking, which Evelyn was not, who is good at sports, which Evelyn was not, who has written this devastating, rebellious book. And so Evelyn, in order to almost out-shock him, his whole life, I think, his whole novels are about out-shocking his older brother. And so things like Var Bodies, which becomes identified with the Bright Young Things, is part of that kind of reaction to the invention of the cocktail party.
Var Bodies is also, I mean, I think by the time it was published in 1930, by which time there's a sense that, I mean, D.J. Taylor, who's written a book about the Bright Young People, sort of says, I think he says at one point, they knew that their pleasures came at a price, that a reckoning awaited them. There's a sense, in a way, that their hedonism, followed by decline, sort of echoes that of their world. And I think Waugh, by that point, is quite aware that this precarious moment of pleasure is sort of about to end. And also, he's just been left by his wife.
Well, in Waugh's case, he marries into the Bright Young Things almost. I mean, he marries the daughter of Lady Beauclerc, who's a flapper, which perhaps you can characterize what a flapper is, but very much identified with these parties. And he marries into this world, and within months, she is being unfaithful with the BBC producer, and he is pushed into the Catholic Church and becomes a Catholic convert. And he becomes very ultra-traditionalist and kind of recoils against the jazz age which he has satirized, and then spends the next few years in the jungle, and Mayfair in the jungle. He's in British Guiana, and he's in Abyssinia, and he's going around the Mediterranean. So he removes himself geographically from the very world that has identified him.
And in that sort of pushing towards and pulling away, it's the novel, Var Bodies sort of resonates a lot with that.
I mean, absolutely. And I think that there's another shared kind of spirit that we haven't yet mentioned, because that pleasure, in a sense, is, as you say, there's a sense that on both sides of the Atlantic that there's a reckoning to come. That pleasure gets frantic very quickly, and there's actually a nihilistic spirit at the heart of all of this as well. And that is what comes, I think, after the war. This sense that that notion of the lost generation, that cliche, does need to be brought in, because there's this sense that, Fitzgerald says this in Echoes of the Jazz Age. He uses the famous Latin tag, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. This sense that life is short, carpe diem, because the pleasure is, I think it has a very different sensibility from the way that we might approach pleasure now. It isn't a pure kind of hedonism. It is a reactive
But
hedonism.
I think, too, they were absolutely haunted by, they would have known their elder brothers died in the First World War.
Yeah.
And I think that haunts this sort of brittle pleasure.
Yeah, it does.
All the way through.
At
And
the
then
end of Var
towards the
Bodies,
end of
you
the,
have
exactly.
The car crash in which the flapper wife dies.
Yeah.
I think it's
Angela
also,
Runcible,
it's also important, though.
And the car crash in Gatsby. Is
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is important, though, to note as well that in America, and again, you see this, say, in Gatsby, people often ask me about why the war has such a small role in The Great Gatsby. There's actually very little mention of the war in the novel. And I think it is important to remember that America got off very lightly from the First World War. We entered it very late. Our casualties were comparatively low. We actually lost more people to the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic than we did in the First World War.
I think we did too.
So there isn't that, we don't have culturally quite that same sense of decimation, but there is that sense of brittleness and of a kind of unloosed energy, which for us has as much to do with prohibition as it has to do with the First World War.
Do you want to maybe, prohibition's interesting because it's it turns drinking into a political act in a way that it wasn't.
Yeah.
So do people drink in Gatsby? They do.
Oh,
I
yeah.
seem to
Oh, yeah,
remember
like
they
fish.
drink quite a lot. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that is, but is it actually prohibition, or is Gatsby so far above all this?
Oh no, it's actually prohibition. They drank like crazy during prohibition. So what happens, I mean, it's probably worth explaining to people what prohibition was and how it worked very quickly. Prohibition is passed at the beginning of 1920. So for America, the Jazz Age is synonymous with prohibition. Prohibition is passed in January 1920. And it actually was the end of a long reform movement. It actually began in the 19th century. And there were 3 simultaneous reform movements. One was to abolish slavery, one was to get women the vote, and one was the temperance movement, to get America to stop drinking. These are actually more interrelated than they might at first appear. And women getting the vote and prohibition both take much longer than the abolition of slavery, but it's the same movement, and it all comes to a fruition in 1920 for all kinds of complicated reasons. Basically, it takes almost a century for that to happen. And so women get the vote in America at the same time that prohibition is passed, in 1920, in exactly the same moment. And what happens is that prohibition is a spectacular failure from the outset. They attempt to say that alcohol will be completely illegal across the country, but they have nothing like enough agents to enforce it. And it's a farce from the beginning. Nobody is following this law. Nobody is enforcing this law. They said in New York that if you wanted to find a good bootlegger or you wanted to find a good speakeasy, you should ask the nearest policeman. Because the cops were all Irish. And then very rapidly it becomes incredibly corrupt, because they start taking bribes from the bootleggers to keep all the alcohol flowing. And so what happens is alcohol becomes respectable for the first time in a very funny way. I mean, it spectacularly backfires. It's a wonderful example of the laws of unintended consequences. It had been unacceptable for middle-class women to drink in public before, and suddenly they're all drinking. Women get the vote, and it becomes a way for them to express their independence, their political independence. They get drunk, they smoke, they do all the things that they weren't supposed to do. They have sex, and all of that sense of independence. Drinking becomes a very important symbol of that in America, particularly for young people, that they're too cool, which is not an anachronism. Cool is a word that's first recorded to mean our slang meaning of cool in 1918. It's associated with this moment. They want to be cool, they want to be hip, also a Jazz Age term. And they do that by drinking to flout authority and to show that they're not part of this 19th century temperance movement. Modernity is going to be about drinking.
Which is very much true as well in Britain. And also maybe coming into that is the sort of breaking of class boundaries in Britain that sort of relates to the sort of breaking down of boundaries between men and women. That I think the bright young people are overall a sort of a very upper class group. They all have silly names like Dig and Ludo but at the same time, Evelyn, Waugh, Cecil Beaton, these middle-class men get quite easily swept among them. And the Gargoyle Club is sort of, which is the club sort of introduced for bright young people to frequent, is very much somewhere where people can forget their background in a way that just would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. Mm.
I mean, you did have a cross-fertilization of American jazz coming to London. You had the 400 and you had black singers.
Yeah.
And in Decline and Fall, Evelyn Waugh's first novel, you have the famous Yorke, who's the lover of Margot Beast Chetwynd, coming to the school sports day. Yes. And I'm sure that's Waugh's playing already with the American jazz.
Yeah. What's the year of Decline and Fall again?
1928. It comes out.
Yeah. So the same year as Gatsby.
No, Gatsby's 25.
Gatsby's 25.
And I think Waugh was influenced very much by Fitzgerald. And I mean, at the end of Decline and Fall, you've also got an allusion to tango, because some of the prostitutes that Margot, or the girls that Margot will send into prostitution, are going off to Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
Which is seething with kind of tango.
But actually, the tango is much earlier. I mean, the
yes,
tango
but it's
is almost
identified,
20th century,
I think,
but
with
it's still
the Jazz Age.
It's popularized, though.
Popularized
it becomes a big. The 20s are in America. There's a kind of series of dance crazes that sweep America one after the other. The first one's actually the shimmy, and then comes the Charleston. The Charleston. A lot of people associate the Charleston with the Great Gatsby, but in fact, Fitzgerald never uses the word Charleston in the novel. And nobody is actually dancing the Charleston for the very good reason that the Charleston wasn't a dance craze until after The Great Gatsby was published. The novel actually predates the Charleston. So they're probably doing the shimmy in the novel, if you're picturing them dancing. And then after the Charleston, that becomes such a dance craze that there are a series of other dance crazes, including the tango. Other dances get taken up as people they like to do these kind of specialty dances in the 20s. It was one of the things that they did. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a bit about you interviewed quite a few of these bright young people. Did they have a sense of, we look back on it now, it's so new, it's so extraordinary. They must have had a sense of that. Or was there something else sort of overriding the way they just, because by that time too, they must have talked about it quite a lot, which of course always slightly kind of messes up one's memories.
I'm wondering if they even thought of themselves as part of bright young things. I mean, I had Diana Moseley, to whom Our Bodies was dedicated, reading out that passage I'd written about parties. And I got a sense she didn't really
couldn't understand why she was doing it.
And similarly, Harold Acton, I got him to read out from Decline and Fall, which was dedicated to him. And he again had distanced himself, I think, from what was now, he was thought to be very much part of.
But at the same time, I think you also interviewed the Jungmann sisters, Baby and Zita. And they really, as far as I understand it, they really were at the heart of it. And sort of, did they see themselves, or were they slightly puzzled by your questions?
Cecil Beaton, who photographed you, Artemis, and whom I also did.
I was very young.
I did a documentary on Cecil Beaton and interviewed the Jungmann sisters, and they very much physically, aren't they? They're the images of the
They're
jazz
the images,
age.
absolutely.
But again, I remember Theresa Jungmann saying that Evelyn was a very bad dancer.
Yes.
And so already
that doesn't surprise me.
No. She said he was like a white mouse.
But of course, there's a lot of transatlantic movements at this point. Particularly America is affluent after the war, and so of course a lot of American artists are coming to London, and so these people are all meeting and interacting and going to parties together, and are very well aware of it. They're reading each other's books. They're very well aware of what's happening. And of course, Fitzgerald famously takes off for France. He writes Gatsby in Europe, not in America, and they spent some time in London, although Scott and Zelda didn't actually like London very much. But their friend Tallulah Bankhead was a craze in London in the 20s.
Well, one person I interviewed was Sybil Ligon, who was the daughter of the Ligon family, who basically are at the centre of Brideshead Revisited. Her father was turned by war into Lord Marchmain, who has to emigrate because he's been found having an affair with his butler, and the brother-in-law, the Duke of Westminster, calls him my bugger-in-law, and gets him
But that's Lord Beauchamp, isn't it? I thought Lord Marchmain is away rather respectably with the mistress.
Yes, but in Venice. But he's in exile.
He's in exile.
War has protected the truth of what went on.
That's right. Yeah.
So Waugh is playing at the Beauchamp House, Madresfield, with no parents. And this again is a characteristic of the Jazz Age. It's not an adult environment. So he's given the run of this amazing country house in the Malvern Hills. So he's come from Golders Green to this amazing country house with all the children of parents who are no longer there, and they have all the butlers, and I think they're dancing in the halls and the rooms, and Waugh does drawings of gramophone records, which I'm sure are playing jazz, and I think that one of the girls, the sisters, was called Sybil, and I remember interviewing her, and she said, "Oh, these parties, yes, we'd go to parties in London, Marchmain, whatever Marchmain House was, the Beauchamp House in Belgravia. Our parents were away, we would come up to the London house, we'd get wonderful parties, and then I remember one night, I went back home and the door was shut, so I didn't know what to do, so I went to 10 Downing Street where I knew Patsy was there, and I knocked on the door, and it was opened, and the Prime Minister came down in his pyjamas to let me in, and he said, well, you better take the room upstairs." And that's kind of unthinkable today. And Waugh then brought that into Our Bodies. I mean, the scene is repeated. And so I think, again, in summary, I think it's a non-adult world in which they're allowed adult pleasures and access to adult venues
and
this
is
drink
almost the
and
first
sex.
time in history this has happened, really, to any degree. But I want to talk also about class, because as you say, Sybil Ligon, she's the daughter of an earl, or think, yes. And, so that is sort of very... But I was interested to hear what you were saying, Sarah, about how we all think of Gatsby as sort of in those perfect white flannels and the correspondent shoes and all the rest of it. But apparently he wasn't.
No, he's not.
This is a myth.
It is a myth.
It's all about Robert Redford.
Well, Robert Redford has a lot to answer for, I'm afraid. I'm very fond of Robert Redford, but I think he's a terrible Gatsby precisely because I'm very fond of Robert Redford, because he's Robert Redford, because he's spectacularly classy, because he's spectacularly handsome. And so we now have this image of Gatsby as this kind of perfect hero, as this amazing hero. The thing is if he were that obviously a hero, he wouldn't have any of his problems. His problems in the novel all stem from the fact that he's a fake. He's a thug who's made his money illegally, and he's putting on a show. And it's such a bad show that everybody can see through it. And Tom Buchanan says, an Oxford man like hell he is, he wears a pink suit. What happens when they do the movies, they did it with the Lerman and the DiCaprio as well, that pink suit is so pale that it's practically white, and it's incredibly tasteful. Ralph Lauren designs it, but he's wearing a lurid pink suit. He's supposed to be a little bit tacky. That's the point. And so that's why his greatness becomes interesting, because Nick Carraway, our narrator, is the only one who can see past the absurdity of his surface into the greatness of his heart. And that's where Gatsby is great. But Gatsby is not great on the surface, or the story doesn't make any sense. If Gatsby's that fabulous, why doesn't Daisy just run off with him? It doesn't actually make any sense. And so he has to be vulgar. He has to be slightly absurd. But we don't want him to be absurd, because our version of the novel is that he is Robert Redford, he's Leonardo DiCaprio. And we also, but when you look at how Fitzgerald writes it, that's not how he portrays Jay Gatsby. And as I say, you don't have the emotional arc of the discovery of his greatness unless you're pushing past a slightly absurd surface. That's where the poignancy comes from. That he actually is a great art. He has the soul of an artist, but he lives in a Philistine world.
Yeah, but then why was this purely Hollywood that did this, or is there some part of us that wants Gatsby to be perfect?
Absolutely. Look, the way that Nick Carraway narrates the story of Jay Gatsby is beautiful, it's poetic, it's lyrical, it makes him sound, he's always associated with words like magnificent and marvelous. And so we get this image of this fabulous person all the way through. But what Fitzgerald does that's so clever is all of the other characters respond to Gatsby as if he's ridiculous. And so when you actually pay attention to how the other characters respond to him, the people at his party, they actually think he's a little bit sinister and a little bit foolish. Even Owl Eyes, who's a character that they encounter at one of Gatsby's parties, we never find out his name, he's just described as Owl Eyes, and he's been drunk for a week. And he says he came to the library because he thought it would sober him up to be near books. And he's that drunk, and he can see that Gatsby is a fraud. He sees what a fake he is. They all can see that he's a fake.
That's what makes it an almost unfilmable novel in a
Absolutely.
sense. That we need Nick's point of view.
Absolutely.
And so maybe we need to have a pale pink suit that sort of gradually darkens.
So we need a shocking
but exactly,
suit.
that gets lurid,
Yeah,
right? So what you need actually is that dual perspective. And what most filmmakers choose is just Nick's romanticism. But if you only see Nick's romanticism, then there's kind of no movement for the novel. It's just flat.
Do you think Waugh is responding to Gatsby and his portrait of Rex Mottram in Brideshead with the tortoise with inlaid jewellery?
Exactly, exactly. Gatsby is and people don't like to hear this because we have Gatsby very close to our heart, but Gatsby is vulgar. Yeah. His parties are ostentatious. They're in very bad taste. You were asking about class. And one of the many myths that the Great Gatsby has become associated with in our minds is a myth that America, and as an American I can say this, Americans have a myth that is very dear to our hearts, which is that America is a classless society, that we don't have classes, which is a farce. That's totally untrue. It's just blatantly untrue. But we have a different class system from the European class system, but part of what Gatsby is about is caste and class. That money is not enough to get Gatsby the status that he wants. That there is a caste system as well as pure socioeconomic questions of how much money you have. But Gatsby is he's a show-off. He has there's the scene where Tom and Daisy come to his final party, and Daisy doesn't like it, which Fitzgerald is very clear about. Nick says that Daisy was appalled, and offended. Those are the three words that he uses to describe her reaction to the party when she sees the people that Gatsby actually hangs out with. They're tawdry. And Tom is laughing all the way through the party. Gatsby introduces him as my friend Tom Buchanan, the polo player. Perhaps you'd like to meet my friend, the movie director. Perhaps you'd like to meet this very famous actress. He's a name dropper. And it embarrasses all of the aristocratic, the patrician, aristocratic, the wrong word, I think, but patrician people around him. And the Buchanans are establishment. And they are very, very embarrassed by this kind of tacky display at his party. And Nick has become used to it and has started to see that the energy of these people at Gatsby's party is the energy of the Jazz Age. It's the energy of raw, new, young America. It's the energy of modern life. It's the energy of new social mobility and upward mobility. It's the energy of these people making money, and they're going to have a good time. And they don't care that they don't play by the patrician rules. But Gatsby is trying to join that world and failing.
It's interesting, the relationship between class and money, I think, is interesting
exactly.
in relation to Wild Bodies, where suddenly, I mean, I think with the Bright Young Things, you have this sense that where in England class had mattered far more than money, and people were sort of getting on perfectly well in their falling apart houses. Suddenly the daughters in these falling apart houses are sort of spending ludicrous amounts. There's one of the Ponsonbys, the Ponsonby mother sort of writes to her daughter saying, "What do you mean you take a taxi everywhere? How can you possibly afford that? Who's paying for it?" And in Wild Bodies, we have the hero is effectively left because he can't afford to marry, and she goes for a man she doesn't particularly like because he's got money, if no class.
Well, what's happening? Sybil Ligger is going off with Lord Beaverbrook as a kind of quiet mistress. So the aristocratic, impoverished flappers are kind of looking for new money.
Let's just look for a moment at this word flappers, because you were saying that this is, if you are sort of the upper middle class people who are throwing these extraordinary parties, you don't necessarily want, if you're a girl, you don't want to be called a flapper. That's for the people sort of, as it were, you're keeping the door shut.
What is a flapper, Sarah?
Yeah, what is a flapper?
Well, it's interesting because flapper is a British word that it begins as British slang, and then Americans appropriate it and kind of reinvent it and make it their own, and are not aware that it's originally a British term. But a flapper, it's first used in about 1918, 1919, and it does describe a young woman kind of out and about.
Flapping around?
Flapping around. Right. But it does have connotations of the current slang word that rhymes with it, slapper. There is the implication that she's a slightly loose woman, that she's out on the streets, that she's kind of letting it all hang out a little bit too much.
Yeah, but she wears lipstick and smokes.
Exactly, exactly. So that she's...
So to a certain lot, she's already down.
She's absolutely. And so, but what happens in America is that instead of having the decency to feel ashamed of this at all, young women grab a hold of it and absolutely see it as a banner of
so there it would be a badge
autonomy.
of honor.
Absolutely. Zelda Fitzgerald describes herself as a flapper and is very proud, and she writes essays about what it is to be a flapper and what it means. They see it as a kind of declaration of independence. And so young women all over the country want to be flappers and model themselves on the American notion of what it is to be a flapper. But it doesn't, it does have the connotation of slightly loose morals, but again, these are women throwing off the shackles of Victorian and Edwardian society, and so they're happy to have those connotations. But very quickly it also starts to imply that you're a bit silly. And Fitzgerald is seen as this expert on the flappers because his first novel, This Side of Paradise, is the novel that sort of reveals to America that there is this young, these young people are partying and they're necking and they're having petting parties, and it's shocking to middle America. And he talks about the flapper in This Side of Paradise. So his second book, which is a collection of stories, he calls Flappers and Philosophers, and he sees that as a phrase, and that's in 1920. He uses that phrase, Flappers and Philosophers, that there are these kinds of, these young people trying to work out what their view of the world is, and that the flapper is a perfectly legitimate tribute to that youthful spirit that we've been talking about.
Now let's think about the end of it all, the end of this sort of
It all goes so badly.
It all goes so badly wrong. Of course, we've got the Second World War looming, although a lot of people are trying to pretend that's not happening. How does it end? Obviously, too, you can't maintain this pitch of excitement, brittleness. It's going to fall apart.
Yeah. Well, in America, it ends in October 1929. Without any question, with the stock market crash on Wall Street. That's when it ends. And we begin the Great Depression. And at that point, there is you can't sustain it economically as well as not being, but also nobody has the energy for it because you don't have any work. People are committing suicide. So the whole thing comes to a spectacular halt on a specific date in America.
Yeah.
I think the particular group of bright young people we've been talking about are just a bit older by 1930 and are sort of busy doing other things. They get married, they have children. Henry Greene, who was the novelist Henry Greene, whose real name was Henry Yorke, is an interesting one because he was very much part of this set, but sort of was aware of a kind of changing political climate and decided to go and work in his father's factory. And it was sort of an act that, in a way, was a bright young thing, thinking, let's have a factory party, but was also a kind of socialist act of, I want to get to know the workers and see them as more important than my bright young friends. And he then, throughout the rest of the 30s, he sort of pulls away a bit from the kind of more embarrassing sides of his socialism, but also pulls away from the bright young people, and then in 1939 publishes Party Going, which in some ways it's published before the Second World War, but in some ways it's, I think, the first Second World War novel. That it's a novel about a group of bright young things they're waiting for a train that will take them to a sort of 3-week party in France, and there's too much fog. It's rather like waiting at Delhi airport. There's too much fog, and the fog is a sort of symbol of the decadence of these years, and they're stuck in the hotel in the railway station, having a sort of 3-day party that begins as quite fun. It's sort of a slightly nasty hotel, and they quite enjoy it, and they sort of order 5 rooms for themselves, slightly extravagantly, and make themselves cocktails. But meanwhile, one of their aunts is there and has found a dead pigeon and sort of ends up dying in the room next door. And downstairs there's an ever-growing crowd of the sort of ordinary people in the station who feel like they're going to rebel. It's a moment of explosion. It's a moment that you can't have this group of bright young things having a party, looking out onto this crowd, and at some point something has to give way.
I think even further than 1939, for in England in the Jazz Age, almost its last flutter is during the Blitz, when the Dorchester becomes a kind of microcosm of English society. All class vanishes. You have the Foreign Secretary having an affair with Alexandra Metcalfe on the 6th floor. You have Churchill's daughter having an affair with Averell Harriman on the 7th floor. You have the orchestra playing through the night as the bombs are going off. You go off onto the roof to look at London bathed in this fantastic orange glow. And I think that's very much the last, it's kind of an echo of 1918, and sex is happening the whole time with whoever.
But all these people at the same time are working as firemen.
And they're working as firemen. Henry Yorke's coming in from dust on his
And so
his
there's there's a sense that they've at last found a way to combine responsibility with hedonism.
Yes.
That this is a kind of decadence in a way that's much more allowed, that's much less kind of class specific.
So they're going out, the women are going out to work as nurses during the day, auxiliary helpers in the East End, and they come back and there's a kind of fuckathon at night with whoever.
We've been talking about this in terms of, kind of large social forces, the economic system and war, but there's also, of course, the personal toll. And as you say, as Lara rightly says, partly they just get older, so it starts to dwindle. They get married. Some of them settle down, the ones who survive. For people like the Fitzgeralds, it's just there's a physical reckoning. Alcoholism starts to take hold for a lot of these people. Fitzgerald and his friends, they start to fall apart by the early 1930s.
In London
physically,
as well.
they're committing suicide. They're having nervous breakdowns. They're being institutionalized. For Fitzgerald, his drinking gets completely out of control. In the 30s is kind of a lost decade. His wife Zelda has a very serious mental breakdown and is in a psychiatric hospital in and out of psychiatric hospitals for the rest of her life. But even friends of his, people like Hemingway and Edmund Wilson, their alcoholism is really starting to spiral out of control, and it's starting to take its toll on their work, on their relationships, and so they just couldn't sustain it as well. I mean, and I think it is worth at least mentioning that. I mean, that's partly why it all goes spectacularly wrong on a personal level, is that they can't survive it.
That's right, yes.
As a footnote,
middle-aged
Alec War, who had been this good-looking inventor of the cocktail party, and the person Evelyn reacts against to identify. In the 1950s, he is now busted, as like all his contemporaries. He's alcoholic, he's poor, he's run out of money, he's run out of inspiration. His younger brother's now very famous. And he, in desperation, remembers a story. My grandfather had taught him at Sherborne and had got The Loom of Youth published in 1917. And he remembers a story my grandfather told him about my grandfather's family in Jamaica, who had been sugar planters and apparently had black mistresses and a black family. And Alec War remembers this from his childhood and writes a novel called Island in the Sun, which suddenly gets the biggest advance in movie history. It spawns Harry Belafonte singing Island in the Sun in the film, and this becomes the logo for Island Records, for the great reggae. And so I like the way the Jazz Age possibly ends in reggae.
Yes, exactly.
Via
your grandfather.
And then the tango, exactly.
Tango.
It's fantastic.
I'm not sure whether we have reggae age novelists in England.
I can't think of.
Sure we do,
any
that's probably just us being sort of slightly older than we should be to enjoy it. Anyway, now perhaps it's time to open it up for a few questions. Oh, yes, we have a lady in the brown sari there. Yes, I think she was the first. Yes. Who's that? The lady on the left there. That's it. She's holding the papers. That's it.
Yeah, okay. It's not a sari, actually. You know, I was interested, the British novel and the American novel in the 19th century were pretty similar, social books and fat books. In the early 20th century, there's apparently a difference. You have modernism and you have the Jazz Age, which is literal realism. At the same time, I was just wondering if we could compare Fitzgerald to Gatsby, to two books, because you have Heart of Darkness, and you have a Nick Carraway kind of character, Marlowe, talking about Quds, who becomes decadent and wild and goes overboard. And you have Christopher Isherwood, Goodbye to Berlin, and you have the film Cabaret, and that's about brittleness. I was wondering if they were all exploring or reacting to unconsciously in very different ways.
Shall I? Yeah, absolutely. I think the Conrad and Isherwood have slightly different relationships to Gatsby because, of course, Isherwood is later, and so he's reworking Gatsby and thinking through. But yes, I agree that sense of a world that's sinking into decadence and that needs to kind of find its way out of that, and the way that's going to that's seen as a kind of microcosm for the way that society is going and the rise of fascism, and that, I mean, those are very similar energies. But I think Isherwood owes a debt to Fitzgerald there. Fitzgerald owes a debt to Conrad, as you say, and Fitzgerald was the first to admit it. He was a huge fan of Conrad, and he said that Conrad was one of the most important influences on him as a writer. He said that Nostromo was the book that he most wished he had written. He certainly learned the function of Nick Carraway, as you rightly say, from Marlowe. There's no question about that. There's a great story, actually. Conrad, his only trip to America was in 1923. He came to Long Island, where Fitzgerald was living. And Fitzgerald was living near to a writer called Ring Lardner, who was also a very heavy drinker. And so the two of them used to stay up all night drinking and talking about books and then drinking some more. And then the joke was that Ring Lardner they'd drink until 6 a.m. and then Ring Lardner would say, well, I guess the kids have gone to school now, I might as well go home. So one night, the story goes that Ring Lardner and Scott Fitzgerald got incredibly drunk, as they were wont to do, and they wandered over to the nearby estate, the Doubleday estate where Conrad was staying, and they danced a hornpipe on the lawn and sang a sea shanty in honor of the old sea captain. But he didn't come out to hear their tribute, and the security guards removed them from the estate. That was as close as he got to meeting Conrad. But he was a big fan of Conrad, and Conrad died while he was working on Gatsby in 1924. And a friend of his tells the story of coming and finding Scott Fitzgerald standing on a balcony with tears pouring down his face, saying, Conrad's just died. So he was an incredibly important
I think I would say there isn't that sort of clearer gap between Jazz Age literature in America on the one hand and literary modernism in Britain. I think in Britain itself there's a again, a not very clear divide between the kind of high modernism we associate with Woolf or Joyce and Ireland, and these more kind of popular novels of war. And someone like Henry Greene, again, is somewhere in between, that he's part of the sort of the Jazz Age set, but the Bright Young Things, but his writing is very modernist.
Yes.
I think there is a
but
difference.
Fitzgerald is also, I would say, I totally agree with that. I also would debate that distinction that you made, because Hemingway is certainly a modernist. Fitzgerald is a kind of, in a style of his own, but many of his experimentations are also modernist experimentations.
And if there is a British-American difference, I think it's much more about the sentence in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that what you get with America is that because they are professional writers and because they don't have family money to fall back on, they have more commercial pressures on their books, so they can't be as experimental. And then neither Fitzgerald or Hemingway, who are the two great prose modernists in America of the time, and Faulkner, of course, as well. But for Fitzgerald and Hemingway, certainly, they get caught up in the mythos of their own celebrity as well, and so they want to have commercial popularity, so they're not willing to be quite as experimental. Faulkner, of course, is perfectly happy to be as experimental as they come, and he's our example of high modernism.
But Sarah, where do you put Ronald Furbank?
I tend not to put him there.
Put him anywhere.
I tend not to include him in the conversation very much.
Although he was the favourite writer of, Waugh and Co.
Absolutely.
He was,
I mean, it's interesting. We were talking beforehand about the way that literary reputations kind of ebb and flow and dip and recede. And Ronald Furbank was very, very popular at the time, and he's really his reputation has flagged. And I think he was an important influence on them, and they learned from him. I personally don't think that his work holds up very well. I think it's dated. It's very interesting to go back and look in the early 1920s about the writers that they were all convinced, people like Fitzgerald and his friends, Edmund Wilson, the great critic, were convinced of who the great writers and what the great novels of the era were going to be. The novel that they all said in 1922 was going to be the novel from American literature that survived from the 1920s was a book called Cytherea by Joseph Hergesheimer, which I'm sure you've all read and know backwards and forwards. It's a book that nobody has ever heard of anymore. It's totally unreadable. And I tried. Nothing dates faster than a novel. Right, I tried to read that, and in a kind of good spirit of scholarship, and I couldn't get through it. And they were convinced that it was the novel that was going to stand the test of time. And they would never have believed that Scott Fitzgerald was going to write the masterpiece. We ought to take another question. Gentleman in red there. Can't see very well. Yeah, the gentleman there.
Can you talk about the relationship between the Jazz Age and the Art Nouveau movement?
And the what, sorry?
The Art Nouveau movement.
The Art Nouveau. Do you want to take that? I mean, I think that it's more Art Deco.
Yeah, exactly. It's more Art Deco than Art Nouveau.
So I think Art Nouveau then leads into Art Deco, and Art Deco is more of the
Art
Jazz
Deco,
Age.
of course, is much more angular, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a way, and those flat surfaces, and everybody loving the sort of the invention of beige and white carpets everywhere and mirrored surfaces. I was sort of imagining.
And Henry Greene's very good in party going on the fact that everyone has exactly the same flat with exactly the same design, that it sort of becomes a kind of trademark.
Although apparently one of the sort of, I'm always intrigued by this story that at the Gargoyle Club, which was sort of the big club where everybody hung out in London, there was one of the sort of main rooms, which was like a dining room, was covered in a wall made of cracked mirror, tiny, tiny bits of cracked mirror everywhere. And this was apparently the idea of Matisse, who was immediately made an honorary member.
That's a great story.
But I'm afraid I don't think we've got very much to add about that. Let's take another question. There's a gentleman in a stripy scarf behind you.
Thanks. I'm not sure if you've already covered this, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connection between the Jazz Age and how it interacted with the Harlem Renaissance and...
About what, sorry?
With the Harlem Renaissance
right.
this kind of race relation within... Because you've been talking about the Bloomsbury Circle, the Lost Generation, which was by and large, fairly white and middle class.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The Harlem Renaissance is a really important part of 1920s American literary life, and you're absolutely right to remind us to bring that into the conversation. It's incredibly important. And for those of you who don't know, the Harlem Renaissance is the name that's given to a series of African American intellectuals living in Harlem and New York, intellectuals, writers, artists. And there is an absolute outpouring of brilliant creative work. So the poet Langston Hughes, the writer Zora Neale Hurston, the writer Nella Larson, who has been, speaking of undeservedly forgotten, wrote 2 wonderful novels called Passing and Quicksand in 1928 and 1929, and very much deserves to be brought back into the conversation. And of course, what you get is white New York going up to Harlem to get jazz, because that's where it's happening, to go to the Cotton Club, to go to these speakeasies. One of the things that people forget, though, and I don't know how many of you have seen Baz Luhrmann's film of The Great Gatsby, but it's a good example of what we forget in our myths about the novel. So he depicts this kind of cozy interracial world where people are going into speakeasies and black and white are dancing together and they're making out and it's all fine. And I'm afraid it wasn't like that. In fact, even the Cotton Club, the famous nightclub in Harlem, people don't realize anymore, it was barred to black customers. There were black entertainers and black staff, but the color bar was still in place, and so only white customers could go. And of course, even if legally black customers had been allowed in, they wouldn't have been able to afford it. So a white upper class and upper middle class New Yorkers are going up and slumming effectively. And so the racial politics of that get complicated. But one of the things I found in my research that surprised me was that in 1922, which is when The Great Gatsby is set, at the end of 1922, I found a story in the New York Times about a young black man who was nearly lynched in Hell's Kitchen in Midtown, New York, in 1922. A lynch mob of 2,000 people chased him for allegedly kissing a white woman. He had to be rescued by the police. So the only difference between New York and the Deep South is that the police would rescue him. But otherwise, the KKK is going strong in New York, in Long Island, in New Jersey. So and that's why Tom Buchanan being a white supremacist matters in the novel. The rise of fascism is part of what is happening here as well. So it is a really important question for both the white writers that we've been talking about, but also the important Harlem Renaissance writers that you mentioned. Good. Gentleman in the hat at the front there.
Hello, I'm Peter Thompson from the country that produced Baz Luhrmann. I'm sorry.
You're not responsible for him, it's
No,
okay.
Not at all. Wonderful session, thank you. You've painted this rich picture of the 20s, but I wonder if you can relate it to our world, because young people now, I sense, feel that we are coming to the edge of the cliff, and there is a sense of burning the candle at both ends. I wonder if you can relate the 20s to our present dilemmas.
Yeah, would anyone like to take that? Either of you want to take that? I can do that, but I'm happy for other of you if you have some
carry
thoughts
on.
on it. I don't want to dominate the Q&A, but very quick. I mean, certainly in America, the parallels are extraordinary, and this is what I was researching. So the sense that actually the boom and bust, the corrupt financiers, the sense that there are, oligarchs are kind of taking over, and that I think for me the strongest parallels are this notion of how corrupt the people in charge are, and again that's a part of what The Great Gatsby is about. And so one of the things I found was that in America the recent crash was very much associated with Ponzi schemes because of Bernie Madoff, right? So for us, the Ponzi scheme became kind of one of the catchphrases of the recent crash. And the Ponzi scheme is named for Charles Ponzi, who was a swindler in the early 1920s. And so the parallels are actually incredibly strong. And it is, I think, a case of our having been doomed to repeat history because we didn't pay any attention to it. The regulations, historically, the regulations that were put into place after the crash, the Glass-Steagall regulations, were what enabled that crash not to happen again. And we lifted them, and so then we did it all over again.
That's right.
But I'm not sure you're getting the same literary
No, we're really not. It's so
flourishing
disappointing.
of literary models
And
reflecting this.
And also the same sort of effervescence of youth that now it's incredibly hard to... Those novels that people published then at 21, 22, 22 they're not that good. Henry Greene's first novel, Blindness, is not a great novel, but it set him on his, on his path. And young novelists of that age couldn't publish those first novels.
But Evelyn Waugh's first novel is still a great novel.
It's still great, yeah.
But the thing is now, if you write a novel at 22 and you're published, the pressures on you are intolerable. And actually it's a terrible thing, I think, the most appalling weight to have a very, very early success, because then your publishers are pushing, telling you, you've got to write another novel, within a year.
I mean, Graham Greene didn't break through.
You were allowed to sort of find your own pace a little bit, to be nurtured.
Graham Greene didn't break through till his 7th novel. I mean, he has a nice hit, then he doesn't have a hit, and
that's right.
He wobbles along until the time.
Published.
He's still published.
Whereas now, if you have a big hit and then your next one fails, that's it. But because we're dominated by the electronic point of sale.
Absolutely, but I think again this is a parallel, certainly with the American 1920s, that I mentioned earlier that the very phrase mass media is coined in 1923. There's a notion of celebrity culture and a self-feeding celebrity culture, that sense of how modern life actually works. For America, it certainly comes into flower in the 20s. And for me, it's really the story of the early 1920s in America is the story about the beginning of American life as we know it, the beginning of the American century. So-called, I hasten to add. I'm not endorsing that idea.
Thank you very much for that question. There's a gentleman right there.
Thank you. Wonderful session. I speak for people like me who are married to the upper caste, a class, decadence caste. A follow-up from this question, maybe a little challenging, but do you think India is going through that period? Because Meghnad Desai said we are not a country, we are a society. We are finding a tea vendor wanting to be a prime minister, White Tiger, Rohinton Mistry. These writers are coming to my mind. Do you think, can you relate to India what you've been seeing? The political fight, the economic downturn, the decadence of even somebody's committed suicide a few days ago. Do you see us going through that period to become a nation?
I really don't know enough. I'm ashamed to say.
I know it's a challenging question, but you're a great reader. I've really enjoyed your session. I'm sure you read our newspapers. You've heard about our rapes. You've heard about our corruption. Are we going to, and the writers that Indians are coming out with, many books come to me, but White Tiger. Are we going through this class decadence period to come out of it?
I think your producer, I'm going to speak as something. My father was born in Shimla, one of his proudest attributes, I think. And I would say, coming back here, that India, the excitement of reading your novels is far greater than I have in reading contemporary, say, British novels. I think, and maybe this is a reaction to what you're describing. The energy is very similar to what has been happening in the 1920s.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm also by no means an expert and wouldn't claim to be, but it has seemed to me, as I've been working on The Great Gatsby, that we see very similar energies in actually the three great countries, in Russia and in China as well. A very similar sense of people getting money and that changing society very quickly, and then the way that corruption follows, and this sense of how are we actually going to invent ourselves with this sudden explosion of possibility. What do we do with those possibilities? And I think that you see, my sense is, from the little that I've read, that you're seeing people have said to me, who today would be most like Jay Gatsby, and I've said he would be a Russian oligarch. I mean, he's a Russian mobster. I mean, I think that's what he is. But I don't see any reason why he couldn't be a Chinese mobster or an Indian mobster. That sense that this is how people are making their way through a world where old restrictions have been lifted.
I think a very reassuring parallel for India is the way that literature is being used to express this in the way that it was in Britain or America in the 20s. And now, as Nicholas was saying, now in England, the novel isn't the sort of the primary exciting medium. Young people aren't reading novels. And here, it's been wonderful for us coming to a literary festival and looking out and seeing young people.
Here. Well, you go to a literary festival in London and everybody is sort of my age and above.
It's true.
I think as a practicing novelist, my eyes are trained on Indian writers.
Yeah. From that point of view, as a sort of hopeless optimist, I think it's all going fantastically well.
Can I ask, I've been really curious about this, is The Great Gatsby a popular novel in India? Do you read it a lot? Okay, do you read it in school? No, some yes, some no. Okay, interesting. Okay, so you all like it? Good, excellent, that's what we like to hear.
Wonderful. Well, I think on that happy note, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Artemis. And thank you,
really good.
Lara. Thank you so very much for this wonderful session.